However, there is just one thing missing: motion blur. So we have this clip here where we're doing multiple speed ramps and it looks pretty cool. However, it doesn't look very realistic. Motion blur, like when I move my hand, looks realistic because that's how we perceive life in reality. And when we have this clip here doing the speed ramp, we don't have any motion blur because the velocity that we added on is fake, it's external. And because we added velocity in post, we need to add motion blur in post. So how do we do that? Now there's two ways to do this. The first way is the free way, which we all love, and that is by going into our effects and looking for the Gaussian blur effect. Now you can use directional blur, but if you increase the blur length, you see we get this kind of vignetting on the side, and we don't like that. So let's go to Gaussian blur, drag this in, make it horizontal, and you can see that if we increase it, we get this kind of horizontal motion blur. And what you want to do is actually add keyframes to this. Now before you try this out for yourself, if you were to add keyframes to Gaussian blur on the clip as it is, for example, having the motion blur here, keyframe, move forward and then drop it down, you will see that the blur just dropped down after 2 frames. And that's because we are adding a keyframe to something that's already been sped up. So we can't just add Gaussian blur to our clip. We have to actually add Gaussian blur to either a nested version of our clip, so right click, nest, okay. Or what I like to do is just simply click down here, new item, adjustment layer, okay, drag an adjustment layer on top, then we can drag our Gaussian blur effect here. And you can see if I just click toggle animation, increase the horizontal only, increase the motion blur, and then here at the end, make it down to 0. You can see that for the full time, we have the motion blur coming in. And then you can actually cut this out, hold Alt, drag it to the right, resize it, and then just change the value. So at the beginning, we start at 0. At the maximum speed here, let's make it 57. And at the end, we just click this button to reset down to 0 and move it to the right. And if we do a preview, this is what it looks like. Now, because this is the free version, there is one main issue with it, and that is the fact that the actual motion blur isn't really going in the direction of the movement. You can see here, our clip is going kind of up, right? And you can see we're not actually getting that right. Now, you could use directional blur, which has the ability for you to change the direction of the blur. So say we make this, for example, 57. We can change the direction of the blur such that if it's going up, we can go up. The only issue is you have this vignetting, and then you have to add transform effect and then increase the scale to like 105 or up until when you stop seeing the vignetting. And then here you could basically do the same thing where you add a keyframe to the blur length and the direction. So we can start with the blur length at 0 here. As we're moving, you can see the blur just makes a lot more sense because we have now a direction to it. The only thing is you have to do the scale, and as a result, you can't just add the motion blur like this, because you see that if I go to this frame, we now have a punch in. So now we have to actually make the adjustment layer the same length of this and then keyframe the directional blur for everything. So you can see we pre-rendered this, and this looks a lot more realistic. You will have to play around with motion blur levels. You don't want it to be too much so it doesn't look realistic. But that is the pros and cons of using directional blur or Gaussian blur. Now, if you want to get the best motion blur and the one that all of the pro guys use it, I use a paid plugin called RSMB, which I can drag in. And just by dragging it in, I can now pre-render it. And obviously it's going to take more time to pre-render. And you can see now we get very realistic looking motion blur. The foreground's motion blur is different to the background. The things that are moving fast have more motion blur. But what you can do is once you add RSMB, you only have to add it to the bits that need it. So the bits that are moving. So I just cut it out from the other ones. Pre-render it, and you will see here the pre-rendering is much faster, even though I added more value. And you can see we get the most realistic looking motion blur. And if you have the budget, I recommend you get it, or you try and find some other ways to get it. So now you know how to speed ramp in Premiere Pro. What do you do when your footage is a little bit shaky or just doesn't look very good?